So from an aviation perspective, what I say is that we need to be as diverse as the world that we serve. And I think that is truly the description of a privilege, that we have the privilege of being able to move diverse sets of people around the globe. And in order to do that, we have to ourselves be diverse and inclusive. And I think that where I've seen it stick with CEOs, where they really do have skin in the game. Just share a little anecdote with you, if I might, which is we managed to get 216 airlines to sign up to the 25 by 2025. So that's a global commitment. By the end of 2025, 2019 when we launched it, 2025 seemed years away. But now here we are looking down towards the end of 2025. We've got 216 airline signatories to commit to improving their gender target by 25%.
Welcome to Sustainable Futures with Daniela Bas, where innovation meets impact. Join me every first and the third Saturday at 10 a.m. Central European Time for engaging conversations with visionaries reshaping industries like fashion, tech, tourism, sports, and more through social fairness and sustainability. As a global leader and change maker, I share fresh insights and actionable ideas to inspire meaningful change and drive results. Tune in, subscribe, and help shape a brighter, sustainable future. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, in whichever part of the world you are. Something is shifting behind the scenes of global aviation. Numbers are rising, doors once closed are opening, and at the center is a quiet force with a bold agenda. Jane Hoskinson isn't just changing policies, she's rewriting the playbook. What sparked the 25 by 2025 movement, and how? How far can it go? So step inside the cockpit of a silent revolution. Hello, Jane.
Hi, Daniela. Thank you for inviting me here today.
You are an amazing person. I couldn't miss having a conversation with you. Before we dive into today's main topic, I've got an unexpected question for you. Ready for a little surprise?
I am indeed.
Okay, so what's the most unusual item you always travel with that no one else would think to pack?
Oh my goodness. I am a very light packer, but there's one thing that I'm always taking with me these days, and that is my watercolor set so that I can paint when I'm somewhere. So I find that a really, really great comfort to take my watercolors with me and whip them out and do a little watercolor painting.
That was an unexpected answer. So, dear friends, are you curious to know more? All right. Jane Hoskinson is a powerhouse in people transformation, driving systemic change in aviation through talent, learning, and bold diversity initiatives. As a director at IATA, she spearheads global programs like 25 by 2025, which is a reshaping gender equity in a traditionally male-dominated field, allow me to say, Jane. And
Oh yes, it is male dominated.
And with over 2 decades in human resources and organizational development, Jane crafts scalable strategies that shift culture, leadership, and inclusion. You know, this is one of the topics I really love talking about, and not just for today, but for aviation's future workforce. So, Jane, tell us what and why do some inclusive and diversity strategies stick while others fade, and what role does governance play in that sustainability?
I mean, this is a really important question these days, isn't it? Because, in some parts of the world, we can start to see that people are dialing back on some of their commitments to diversity and inclusion. But I think what we see that's really, really important is that where it is clear, where it's integrated into board monitored activities, where it's at the behest of the CEO and the shareholders, then it starts to stick. And the reason that CEOs and shareholders are interested in diversity and inclusion strategies isn't because it's the right thing to do, right? It is the right thing to do, of course, but it's also because it makes business sense. So, from an aviation perspective, what I say is that we need to be as diverse as the world that we serve. And I think that is truly the description of a privilege, that we have the privilege of being able to move diverse sets of people around the globe. And in order to do that, we have to ourselves be diverse and inclusive. And I think that where I've seen it stick with CEOs, where they really do have skin in the game, just share a little anecdote with you, if I might, which is we managed to get 216 airlines to sign up to the 25 by 2025 initiative. So that's a global commitment. By the end of 2025, in 2019, when we launched it, 2025 seemed years away. But now here we are looking down towards the end of 2025. We got 216 airline signatories to commit to improving their gender target by 25%. And one of my colleagues said to me, what is it that drives these initiatives? And she had like four kind of words for me. One is scandal. So they don't want to be pointed out as the people that are not kind of adhering to this. Ego. So they're doing it. I better do it. Compliance, which plays to your governance question. And also, and I think this is a really important piece, and we start to see it emerging. She was talking to me just today. It's about skills scarcity. So actually, if you think about aviation, the number of people that are traveling gets more and more with each year. But actually, the number of people going into aviation as a career gets less and less. And we really do have to think about how do we match that skill scarcity. So I think that if you think about those four things, if you've got those, the kind of the killer combination that make things stick, rather than just a kind of platitude, you really see when CEOs have got skin in the game that they tend to really push it. And I'm really pleased to see that a lot of the AGMs that are happening now in the US, the shareholders are really saying, no, 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 we do not get rid of the diversity and inclusion initiative. So there does start to be shareholder power as well on these things, which I think is reassuring.
Jane, you mentioned the skills a few times now. When I was an executive, the skills I was looking for in the people I was interviewing or in the staff I was leading were mainly soft skills because the hard skills can be learned. So, which skills were you referring to?
Well, in fact, there's a skills shortage. There's a technical skills shortage. We know that it's getting harder and harder to find maintenance engineers that want to work in airports. We know that there's a really high demand for pilots. We've got a lot of pilots retiring. There are some of the hard skills. But what I think is super interesting is how the soft skills are evolving. Because if we think around the advent of AI and how that is, I don't think we've even understood the full extent to which AI is going to disrupt our lives in aviation, as passengers, as consumers, as staff in aviation. It's going to change everything. But the things that really bind us together will always be the soft skills. And of course, they also are getting harder and harder to find because we withdraw into ourselves. We've got a lot of we've got proxies for social engagement. So we use social media as a proxy for direct conversations like these. And sometimes we have to re-skill people in how to have those conversations, because human beings, there's always friction between us, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how pleasant we are, there's always going to be friction, and many people don't like that friction, and that's also causes them to withdraw. And that's where the soft skills come into play, and I think they are the skills for the future.
Often I'm asked to provide some training to improve interpersonal relationships, communication, and then empathy, which is not really a skill, although we can
Mm.
provide some tools for people to learn how to be a little bit more empathic if maybe they have it ingrained in them, but they haven't discovered that skill in themselves. If the aviation industry were a person, what would you say is its biggest blind spot? when it comes to diversity, and what would you whisper in its ear to make it see differently?
So actually, I'm going to go to a default persona that we think about with aviation, and that is, probably what caused us to create 25 by 2025 in the first place. And that was a CEO of Air New Zealand at the time was a gentleman called Christopher Luxon. He's now Prime Minister of New Zealand. So, from CEO to Prime Minister. And he said to an assembled crowd at one of the IATA AGMs, we cannot be here in 5 more years just looking out at a sea of white middle-aged men. So if it was a person, it's probably a white middle-aged man that is, we see as the kind of in the industry. And I think that causes a blind spot. Now, some of those CEOs that we've worked with are so excellent. They have really strong vision. They're really good. But sometimes one of the most human like nature frailties that we have is we often recruit in the mirror of ourselves. So we really have a tendency with our inherent biases to say, oh, I really like that person. Oh, they look like me, they sound like me, and they behave like me. They must be a good person. And I think what I would say is challenge your bias. Make sure that you're bringing true diversity to the table, because there's a danger, isn't there, when we talk about diversity, that in my world, we default to gender. And that's, because 25 by 2025 is about gender. So it's in some ways natural. That's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what true diversity looks like. Visible diversity, invisible diversity, and I think that's what I would whisper in their ear is like really lean into the full spectrum of diversity. It may not be frictionless because, we recruit it to people that look like ourselves because we know it's going to be a bit easier, but embrace the friction and you will get much, much better outcomes. I think that is what I would say to whoever the persona of aviation is.
I have another question for you, but can you explain a teeny bit more to our audience what you do actually? Because I haven't explained it.
That's fine. So I have a very long job title. I'll give you my job title and then I'll explain what the real job is. The job title is Director of Talent, Learning, Engagement and Diversity. I think that's shorthand for all the really interesting stuff in HR. So I kind of look strategically, and I have two parts to my job. One is internal for IATA, so I look after all of that for IATA, but externally is really kind of where we're driving the diversity and inclusion agenda. So I work with the 216 airlines, and we look at how can we improve gender representation for the industry. Now, we started the initiative called 25 by 2025. It's primarily focused on gender, but I promise you, we bring our signatories together every quarter. We never talk about just gender. We always talk about other things as well that make up the spectrum of diversity and inclusion. And I think that's what makes it such an interesting place to be, is that, as soon as we can open a conversation around one element of diversity, I always think it softens the ground for other elements of diversity and inclusion. Whilst being respectful, there's some carriers that we talk to that you and I met in Saudi. Mm-hmm. There's some discussions around the full spectrum of diversity that we simply wouldn't be able to have. And that is about being respectful to the culture that you operate in. In other places, that's a primary discussion. But it's a word you used before is empathy, and being empathetic to the environment that we work in and making sure that we're kind of adapting to our environment whilst also opening the doors to as many people as possible. And that's a little bit of my job.
Thank you. And raising awareness. Sometimes people are not aware of, they ignore, do not know. So everything helps. Now, what would you say to critics who claim the 25 by 2025 is a nice PR, public relations campaign, but not a structural revolution? And what data or story shuts down that narrative instantly, in your view, Jane?
Yeah, look, I would say that I have been one of the fiercest critics of it, because I think it's okay to criticize your own work. And I would say that, focusing only on gender was important because it was the hook. Now, a lot of critics say, but it's not true diversity and inclusion because we don't talk about accessibility, for example. We don't talk about LGBTQ plus. We don't talk about ethnicity. And if that's the criticism that many people have levied at the initiative, it's not the full broad spectrum of diversity. And I agree with that. But as I said before, it opens the door and it softens the ground for all of the other conversations. So that's kind of one element. There was a little bit, I think, at the beginning of, oh, let's sign up for this initiative. And, it looks good. It looks good. But actually, it's gained momentum. And the momentum manifests itself in data, right? In actual structural change. So when we first started, I think we had 45 signatories in September 2019. When we talked to them, their average for senior leadership was 19%. We've recently taken data from the airlines that have shared the data, and there's about 170 that have shared data with us. We're about 31% females in senior leadership. Now, it's always difficult because you're not comparing apples with apples because that was a group of 45 and this is a much bigger group. But actually, I would say that the pattern is really indicative. And what we can see is a trend over time that we're getting more women into senior leadership positions. And we're holding it firm. So it's not that companies can say, well, I measured senior leadership as being one thing in 2019, but now I'm going to broaden it and make it bigger so my numbers look good. We don't let them do that. It's really important, the firm. And the other place where we see tremendous progress in different parts of the world is with the flight deck. So the flight deck is notorious low. It's started about 4%. We're closer to getting close to 6% now, apart from in India, where they have done the most amazing job. There are about 15% women in the flight deck. And what makes that so remarkable is we've just held our AGM in India, and the Minister of Civil Aviation was on the stage with the Prime Minister of India, Modi, and they talked about they've issued an edict that they are going to push their organisations to get to 25% representation. And you asked earlier the question about what makes these initiatives stick. When a government says you're going to do it, you're going to do it. And so that to me was a real spine chilling moment in a positive way, because I was like, wow, they grasped and they understood that they need to work towards better female representation. And again, talking about Saudi Arabia, I loved going to Saudi and talking about Vision 2030. And I loved the fact that they said, yeah, we set a vision for 30% female representation in the workforce. It's 2025. We set the vision for 2030. We're already past the target, so we're going to readjust the target to 40%. I was just like, that is magic. That's where the magic happens.
Yes, indeed. And planting seeds, it may take time to see the tree grow, but then the fruit is there and it's tasty. We spoke about inclusion and diversity as well. So, can an industry built on hierarchy, precision, and standardization ever truly embrace the messy, uncomfortable work of inclusion? Or does something radical have to break first?
Gosh, I mean, that's such an important question, isn't it? Because you're right, the industry is quite rigid, and it's rigid in order to make sure that safety is a priority. I'm going to just reference a previous life, pre-aviation, where I worked in oil and gas. And again, safety is the number one priority. But actually, diversity is an enabler to safety. Because if you get diverse perspectives, you can see things in different ways. So actually, it's a really important piece of the diversity to make sure you bring in those voices, because, you can, I would imagine you can see it from an accessibility point of view. If you've got someone that isn't in your shoes or, sitting where you're sitting, they're going to see things differently. And so I would say it's not always easy, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And I think if we're really serious about safety, which we are as an industry, I mean, aviation still has one of the best safety records in any mode of transport. We have to make sure it's integrated into what we do. And things have improved massively. I mean, I think about stories from people that working out in carriers like 15 years ago, and they were female engineers and they were in the hangar, and kind of like the movie Hidden Figures, they had to walk 20 minutes to go to the bathroom because there wasn't a decent bathroom for them in a hangar. Well, we don't hear those stories anymore. We hear, adaptations taking place to make sure that there's good accessibility for everyone. So I would say, I would hope that nothing has to break for us to be able to say we integrate everything, because when it's broken, it feels that that's too far. I think that the clever managers actually say, let me bring diversity to the table first in order to road test it and to check that we're looking at everything from this point of view. So it probably seems counterintuitive, but I am all in favor of saying it makes us safer.
You mentioned the bathroom, toilet, or the loo or restroom, whichever part of the world we are, we use a different terminology. And you brought back to me a memory. We're going back in 1986 when I got my first job at the United Nations. And I couldn't start working immediately because there were no accessible toilets at the UN building in Vienna. So it took them 6 months to build the very first accessible restroom within the UN buildings in Vienna. And since then, things started moving. So someone has to break first
Yeah.
old habits and convince also the executives that inclusion, if it is done regularly, it becomes less and less complicated and less expensive.
Totally
And the
agree.
company gains a lot, as you said. Although
I mean,
my question to you was different, but you brought me back that memory. I wanted to share it with you as well.
yeah, and I think it goes back to, if we want to be as diverse as the world we serve, it means we must ask people what that looks like for them. And, I think that some of the airports have been doing really, really great jobs on people who have neurodiversity, and airports can be very overstimulating environments. We know they're
Mm-hmm.
busy, they're frenetic, there's always movement. And, I really kind of see a lot of airlines and airports are really trying to do things differently in the way that they engage people. And we've heard that from our airlines as well. And that's because they opened the door and said, what does it need to look like for everybody, not just for the homogenous 60% of the population? Because, there is a degree of
Yes.
homogeneity, you're right, with the populations. But, it's about embracing that diversity, because everybody should have a right to be able to travel. Everybody. And the more diverse we are, the more that we can make that a reality for people.
And allow me to say, it's also good business for airlines. Ah.
Totally, totally. I mean, and that's kind of what I said before, is like, they don't do it just because it's the right thing. They do it because it makes sense. I mean, you can read every McKinsey article possible, and the data is there around diverse perspectives bring better products. They bring better products, and better products bring more revenue.
Now we move to the second part of our conversation. And Jane, once upon a time, before inclusion was part of corporate, what made you believe it could be engineered into culture?
So that's a really good question. I in 2010 I was working for BP, and you might remember that back in 2010 there was a fairly significant incident in BP in the Gulf of Mexico, or do I have to say Gulf of America? So and that was a shocking incident. And I remember asking somebody, okay, it's not just about safety, is it? There was clearly an accident, but what was the culture that we created where that could happen? And actually, that was a really interesting point for me, that I pivoted and went into internal audit Now, I promise you, if you introduce yourself to somebody and you say, I'm an HR internal auditor, people generally take two steps backwards from you.
Mhm.
But if you are pleasant, they then tell you everything. And that for me was one of the very first moments where I was like, okay, this is a systemic piece. It's not just about kind of inclusion on its own. It's not just about diversity. It's not just about culture, but this is an ecosystem. And we have to think about these things in a really systemic way because they all impact one another. So leadership culture, has to think about diversity. It has to think about inclusion. And so for me, that's where I started to kind of join the dots on these things and said, all these things add up to what is the culture in which we work and how should we be integrating that more effectively into what we do. So yeah, that was my kind of first light bulb moment on this subject.
So presently, based on your previous experiences, personal and also professional, what role does formal leadership education play in transforming not just competencies, but the core values of future aviation leaders? And how do you ensure those lessons stick in high pressure environmental environments?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about aviation training, it takes as many years to be kind of in maintenance, in flight control, as it does to be a medical doctor. We sometimes forget that ultimately these are really high pressure jobs. And the reason that it takes so much training is because you need to be able to repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. For many parts, and a pilot's job can be very routine, but they need to be trained for those emergencies. And I think that leadership training is a little bit the same. There's a sense that you can enter leadership training with your core values. We all have core values. They come from how we were educated. They come from our family, the environment that we work in. Whether we can name them or not, I mean, I think there's some great work around, can you name the values that are important to you? Many people struggle with actually naming them. I would argue that's a piece of work that should be done very early on is who am I and how do I show up and what do I stand for in my leadership signature style? It's really, really important. And I think that sometimes you do have to calibrate. So there may be like risk. You may be by nature a risk taker. Well, leadership training has to be around how do you manage that in a way that doesn't compromise your organization or it doesn't compromise the safety of your organization. So I think leadership training is it's never a one-off. It should be a constant commitment throughout your period, whether you're working for one organization or the other. There's an obligation of the company to invest in your leadership training. There's also an obligation on you to continue your development. And how do you make it stick? It's kind of, I think that's something very symbiotic about these things. You should train and keep an environment where you train, because we know most training and most learning happens on the job. It doesn't happen because I'm in a
Yeah.
classroom. It happens because I happen to be in an emergency and I learn stuff and I reflect. And I think aviation has a great reputation for post incident reviews. So nothing goes unmeasured. And if there's any deviation from the normal measurements, there's a review. Why did that happen? Pilots have to. Why did I? You started your approach earlier. Why? You did your approach too late. Why? And it's that kind of creating that just culture around leadership mentality. So, we have an obligation from an organizational point of view, but I also think that leaders have an obligation to themselves to keep investing in their leadership skills. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Daniela.
Yes, in your role, I wonder if there are other tools you use to ensure that those lessons stick.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something about kind of repetition and making sure that you're
Mm.
continually going through that. So it's not like you say, I've learned this now. So now I've learned to manage risk.
Hmm.
Like, great, but I'm never held to account, because I think that it's about integrating it into everything you do. So we've just done an interesting refresh. We reimagined our values. So we had a
Hmm.
perfectly good set of values, but we wanted to kind of refresh them for the organization. And some of that is about integrating them. We built our program along 3 levels. So communication, repeat, 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 repeat. Learning, so we're building learning to support that, and then integrating it into processes. So if you integrate it into processes and governance, you can't get away from it. So if you say it's important, well, then are you hiring against that? If you say it's important, are you rewarding against that? So some of it is about reinforcing, not necessarily with a big stick, because that doesn't work either, but kind of not giving people leeway, stacking it so that it becomes part of what we do. I'm thinking about James Clear and his atomic habits and habit stacking, and I think that leadership learning is a little bit like that. You have to kind of keep stacking it so that it just becomes part of who you are.
Right. I think I share your views. Now let's move to the future. If you were 20 years old in 2071, what kind of workplace would you dream of joining? And what lessons from today would you want achieved for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have never been at such an interesting moment of what work looks like and how we design work for the future. Because, we talk about AI and the integration of AI. I hear a lot about the application of AI, and I would love to see more robust discussions about the people and ethical dilemmas that AI gives us. We've come from an environment of you get a job and it's a job for life, or it's at least a job for a long period of time. I mean, that's going to change radically. And I think what's interesting is, we can't just think about the workplace as being this kind of 9 to 5 place, but there has to be like integrated ongoing education for people. It has to be, we have to think far more holistically. And I think we have to have some uncomfortable conversations about not just what does work look like, but what does society look like? Because, technology is going to change the way in which we work. And that may mean periods of time where people may not be working while they're pivoting or reskilling or learning new things. We have an aging society. There's a very good chance that we will live to 100. So in 2071, I will be eagerly awaiting my telegram from the king. Or yeah, I would imagine it would still be a king then, but that would be and that will be different because it will mean that we need different kinds of work in society as well. I mean, I still hold on to the hope that everyone goes to work and they feel better at the end of the day than when they came. And that sounds so simple, but work should provide meaning and purpose for people. I know that sounds like idealistic, but actually it's really important because one of the most important foundational pieces of being a human is that we have meaning and purpose and that we can make things better. And so that probably would be the same in 2071, that I would still want that to be what work gives to people.
And leisure time, because with artificial intelligence and robotics, we'll have more leisure time. So that's also another strategic area we have to think about in terms of services and products.
Totally.
That's
And I
what
guess it means I can take my paints with me more frequently when I
yes,
travel.
exactly. We're almost at the end of our conversation, and I would I would like to ask you a question. And the question is, if you would ask yourself, how do strategic priorities like safety and efficiency intersect or clash with the diversity and inclusion goals in aviation? And how do I, meaning Jane, align them without losing momentum on either front? What would be your answer?
Um, I mean, I think there is an alignment between them. I think in my previous my previous thoughts are that you have to align them, because if they're out of sync, I talked about this ecosystem. I think we work in an ecosystem, and it's not either or. I think sometimes we live in a world that's a zero-sum game. It's either diversity or it's safety, or it's either profit or it's accessibility, and it's either this or that. And I think that that's not how we should be approaching things. We've got to be far more giving. And I think, there's some things that are set up that act to be divisive between us. Reward structures in work. For example, I reward you for this, but then this person here, I reward for something differently. How do we reward collectively for achieving these things? We always have these polarizations of choices that we have to make. And it doesn't need to be either or, and it doesn't need to be this and that, but it's somewhere in the middle around compromise. So probably going back to an earlier point you make about empathy allows us to be able to say, where can we make trade-offs where it's necessary and be unflinchingly uncompromising where we cannot compromise on safety, but how do we use diversity as an enabler to achieving those goals?
So empathy could be the bridge that links and connects the various silos. Well, that's a very nice metaphor you gave us. Thank you so much, Jane, for this conversation. What are your plans for today before we say goodbye?
I am going to be playing paddle this evening. So that's my plans for this evening, is to go and do some sport because it's a beautiful day in Geneva.
Thank you so much and have lots of fun. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, Daniela.
As I wrap up this episode, my heartfelt gratitude to today's guest and to all of you. Join me for the next episode as we delve deeper with special guests, uncovering thought-provoking insights and actionable steps, paving the way for a brighter, inclusive, sustainable tomorrow. Thanks also to Damian Morton, music, and Maria Cortez Galliano, social media. Don't miss out next episode on shaping the future we aspire to. Ciao, ciao!